The boy sat slumped against the saloon's outer wall, his wrists bound so tight the rope had worn through skin. His boots were gone. His feet, bare and blistered, rested on the splintered boardwalk, too swollen to curl. The afternoon sun pressed down on Ashford like a branding iron, and the boy didn't move, didn't lift his head, didn't beg. He just sat there, breathing shallow, staring at nothing. "Don't," he whispered when a woman passed too close. "Don't look." She didn't. No one did. Cade Merrick had been riding through Ashford with no intention of stopping. He'd come from a failed cattle drive in Wyoming, his saddlebags nearly empty, his conscience heavier than it had been in years. He was pushing 40 now, and every mile felt longer than the last. His horse needed water. That was the only reason he dismounted outside the livery. But then he saw the boy. Cade froze mid-step, one hand still on the reins. The boy couldn't have been more than 16. His clothes were torn at the shoulder, stained dark with something that might have been blood or dirt or both. His face was bruised along the jaw, and his eyes, those eyes weren't looking at anything anymore. They'd gone somewhere else. Cade's throat tightened. A man in a leather vest stood nearby, leaning against a post, chewing tobacco. He spat into the dust and grinned when he noticed Cade staring. "Something catch your interest, stranger?" Cade didn't answer right away. He walked his horse to the trough, let it drink, then turned back toward the boy. "What's he done?" "Done," the man laughed. "He didn't do nothing. He's for sale." Cade's jaw clenched. "For sale?" "That's right, owner's inside. Name's Terence Lowell, runs a little business out of the back room, helps folks settle debts, offload trouble. Boy's been up for 3 days now, no takers yet." The man shrugged. "Guess he ain't worth much." Cade stood there, the reins loose in his hand, staring at the boy's bare feet. The blisters had split open. Flies crawled along the edges. "Where are his boots?" The man grinned wider. "Lowell took 'em, said the boy claimed he could sleep in his boots, didn't need no bed, no comfort. So Lowell figured if he didn't need 'em to sleep, he didn't need 'em at all." He laughed again, a wet, ugly sound. "Funny, ain't it?" Cade didn't laugh. He tied his horse to the post and walked toward the saloon door. The boy's head lifted slightly as Cade passed, just enough for their eyes to meet. The boy's expression didn't change, no hope, no plea, just a hollow, exhausted stillness. Cade pushed through the door. Inside, the saloon smelled like stale whiskey and sweat. A few men sat at tables, cards and coins spread between them. Behind the bar stood a heavy-set man with a thick mustache and cold eyes. He looked up when Cade entered, sizing him up in one sweep. "Help you?" "You Terence Lowell." "Depends who's asking." Cade stepped closer, his boots heavy on the warped floor. "The boy outside, what's his price?" Lowell's expression didn't shift. He set down the glass he'd been wiping and folded his arms. "You interested in buying or just curious?" "I asked the price." Lowell studied him for a long moment, then named a figure. It wasn't high, just enough to sting. Cade had the money barely. It would leave him with almost nothing, but he had it. "Why's he tied up like that?" "Because he ran twice already," Lowell said flatly. "Figured the sun and the shame might teach him to sit still." Cade's hand twitched near his belt, but he didn't move. "And the boots?" Lowell smiled, slow and cold. "Boy said he didn't need comfort. I took him at his word." Cade stared at him, his pulse thrumming in his ears. He thought about walking out. He thought about the long ride ahead, the empty months, the cattle he'd lost, the debts still hanging over him. He thought about all the ways this wasn't his problem. Then he thought about the boy's feet. "I'll take him." Lowell raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" "I'll take him," Cade repeated, "and I want the boots." Lowell laughed, short and sharp. "Boots ain't part of the deal." "Then make them part of the deal." The two men stared at each other across the bar. Somewhere in the back of the room, a card slapped onto a table. A chair creaked. The air felt thick, suspended. Finally, Lowell shrugged. "Fine, boots and the boy pay up front." Cade reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He counted the coins slowly, deliberately, then slid them across the bar. Lowell scooped them up without counting, then disappeared into a back room. When he returned, he was holding a pair of worn brown boots, scuffed and dusty, but intact. He dropped them on the bar with a thud. "Pleasure doing business." Cade took the boots and walked out without another word. The boy was still sitting against the wall, his head lowered. Cade knelt in front of him, set the boots down gently beside him, then pulled a knife from his belt. The boy flinched. "Easy," Cade said quietly. "Jay. Us the ropes." He sawed through the bindings, careful not to cut skin. The ropes fell away, and the boy's hands dropped into his lap, limp and raw. Cade picked up the boots and held them out. "These yours." The boy stared at them, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Put them on." The boy didn't move at first. His hands trembled as he reached for the boots, and it took him a long time to pull them on over his swollen feet. He winced with every motion, but he didn't make a sound. When the boots were finally on, the boy sat there staring down at them. His shoulders shook once, just once, and Cade looked away. "Can you stand?" The boy nodded. Cade helped him to his feet. The boy wavered, unsteady, but he stayed upright. Cade led him to his horse, then glanced back toward the saloon. Through the window, he could see Lowell watching them, arms crossed, that same cold smile on his face. Cade turned away and handed the boy the reins. "What's your name?" The boy's voice came out rough, barely more than a whisper. "Ethan." "All right, Ethan, we're leaving." Ethan looked up at him, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Where?" "Anywhere but here." They walked together down the dusty street, the horse between them, and no one in Ashford said a word. They rode west for 3 hours before Cade finally stopped near a creek bed. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in shades of rust and gold. Ethan had been silent the entire ride, sitting behind Cade on the horse, his hands barely gripping the saddle. When they dismounted, he stood awkwardly, shifting his weight from foot to foot, still wincing. Cade built a small fire and set a pot of coffee to boil. He didn't talk, and Ethan didn't ask questions. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence stretching between them like a canyon. Finally, Cade spoke. "You said you could sleep in your boots." Ethan's gaze dropped to the flames. "I did." "Why?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them. "Because I didn't want them thinking I needed anything from them, didn't want them thinking they could give me comfort, and I'd be grateful for it." Cade poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Ethan. "So they took them anyway." "Yeah," Ethan's voice was flat. "Guess I'm not as tough as I thought." Cade sat back down, cradling his cup. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "You got family." Ethan shook his head. "Not anymore." "What happened?" Ethan hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Farm burned down 4 years ago. My pa died in the fire. My ma, she got sick after that. Didn't last long." He paused. "I tried to keep the land, but I couldn't pay the taxes. Bank took it. I've been working odd jobs since then, trying to stay ahead. Didn't work out." Cade said nothing. "Lowell found me in a camp outside Ashford," Ethan continued. "Said he'd give me work, a place to stay. I believed him." He laughed bitterly. "Stupid." Cade's hand tightened around his cup. "You weren't stupid, you were desperate." Ethan looked at him then, really looked at him, and something shifted in his expression. "Why'd you buy me?" Cade didn't answer right away. He set his cup down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice, when it came, was low and rough. "Because I know what it's like to be tied up and left to burn." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Cade was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his shirt and pulled out a small, tarnished pocket watch. He turned it over in his hands, his thumb tracing the engraved initials on the back, EM. Ethan's eyes widened. "Where'd you get that?" Cade's throat worked. "Your father gave it to me 12 years ago." Ethan stared at him, his face pale. "You knew my pa?" "I did." Cade's voice was barely above a whisper. "We worked together on a ranch outside of Larkspur. Your pa was a good man, honest, hardworking. He paused, his jaw clenching, and I got him killed. Ethan went very still. What? Cade closed his eyes. There was a fire, not the one that took your farm. This was years before that. A barn fire on the ranch. Your pa and I were inside trying to get the horses out. The roof started to collapse. I made it out. He didn't. Ethan's breath hitched. You left him. I tried to go back, Cade said, his voice breaking. I swear I tried, but the flames. He stopped, shaking his head. I couldn't reach him, and when the roof came down, I thought he was gone. But he wasn't, Ethan said, his voice shaking. He survived. He came home. I didn't know that until years later, Cade said. By then, I'd already left Larkspur. I couldn't face what I'd done. I heard about the fire at your farm, heard your pa died, and he broke off, his hands trembling. I thought maybe it was my fault, that if I'd gone back for him that first time, if I'd been braver, maybe he would have been stronger. Maybe he would have survived the second fire. Ethan stared at him, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. You think you killed him? I think I failed him, Cade said quietly, and I've been carrying that ever since. Ethan stood abruptly, his fists clenched. You don't get to do this. You don't get to buy me and then tell me you're the reason my pa's dead and expect, what, forgiveness, gratitude. I don't expect anything, Cade said, his voice steady. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just telling you the truth. Ethan turned away, his shoulders heaving. You should have left me there. Maybe, Cade said, but I didn't. They stood in silence, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Ethan sat back down, his head in his hands. He gave you that watch. He did, said it belonged to his father, and his father before that told me to keep it safe. Cade held it out. It's yours. Ethan looked at the watch, then at Cade. Slowly, he reached out and took it. His fingers closed around it, and he stared down at the initials, his eyes glistening. He never talked about you, Ethan said quietly. Not once. I wouldn't have either, Cade said, if I were him. Ethan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I don't know if I can forgive you. You don't have to. Ethan looked at him, his expression raw and unguarded. Then why are you helping me? Cade met his gaze, his voice firm. Because some things are worth standing for, even if it doesn't fix what's broken. They sat together in the firelight, the watch resting in Ethan's palm, and the silence between them felt a little less hollow. They didn't hear the riders until it was almost too late. Cade was checking the horse's saddle straps the next morning when he caught the sound, hoofbeats, distant but deliberate. He froze, his hand going to the rifle strapped to his saddle. Ethan, who'd been crouched by the dying embers of the fire, looked up sharply. Someone's coming. I hear it. Cade pulled the rifle free and scanned the horizon. Dust rose in the distance, a thin line against the pale morning sky. 3 riders, maybe 4. Ethan stood slowly, his face tight with fear. You think it's Lowell? Could be, Cade's jaw clenched, or someone he sent. The riders came closer, their silhouettes sharpening in the early light. Cade counted 3 men, all armed. The one in the lead wore a silver star pinned to his vest. Sheriff, Cade muttered. Ethan's face went pale. What do we do? Stay calm, let me talk. The riders pulled up 20 feet away, their horses snorting and stamping. The sheriff, a lean man with a hard, weathered face, dismounted slowly, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. The other 2 men stayed on their horses, rifles across their laps. The sheriff's eyes swept over Cade, then Ethan, then back to Cade. Morning. Morning, Cade said evenly. I'm Sheriff Dalton. Got a report from Ashford about a man who bought a boy yesterday. Description matches you. His gaze flicked to Ethan. That him. He is. Dalton's expression didn't change. Terence Lowell says the boy was sold under contract. Says you took him without fulfilling the terms. Cade's grip on the rifle tightened. I paid what he asked. Took the boots too, deal's done. Lowell disagrees. Dalton took a step closer. Says the boy's still his property under territorial law. Says you stole him. Ethan's breath caught. Cade didn't move. That's so. Cade's voice was calm, but his pulse hammered in his ears. And what law's that, Sheriff? Dalton's smile was cold. The one I enforce. The two men behind him shifted in their saddles, fingers brushing their rifles. The air went tight, electric. Lowell's paying you to say that, Cade said quietly. Dalton's smile widened. Maybe doesn't make it less true. Cade's mind raced. He could fight, 3 against 1, maybe 2 if Ethan could hold a gun steady. But the odds weren't good, and even if they won, they'd be running for the rest of their lives. What do you want? Cade asked. Boy comes with me, you ride on, simple. Ethan stepped forward, his voice shaking. No, I'm not going back. Dalton's eyes slid to him, cold and uninterested. You don't get a say, boy. He does, Cade said firmly. He's not property. Territorial law says otherwise. Dalton's hand moved closer to his pistol. Now, I'm trying to keep this civil, don't make it something else. Cade stared at him, weighing the moment. Then, behind Dalton, one of the riders spoke up. Sheriff. Dalton turned. What? The rider was looking past them, toward the ridge behind Cade and Ethan. We got company. Cade followed his gaze. On the ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun, were 5 more riders. They sat motionless, watching. Cade didn't recognize them at first, but then one of them nudged his horse forward, and Cade's chest tightened. It was old Ben Holloway, a ranch hand Cade had worked with years ago in Larkspur. Beside him were 4 others, weathered men with rifles and hard faces, men who'd worked the land, survived droughts and rustlers and fires. Ben called down, his voice carrying across the distance. Cade Merrick, that you? Cade swallowed. It's me, Ben. Thought so. Ben's eyes shifted to Dalton. This man giving you trouble. Dalton's jaw tightened. This doesn't concern you, Holloway. Sure it does. Ben rode down slowly, the others following. Cade and I worked cattle together for 5 years. He pulled me out of a stampede once, saved my life. He glanced at Ethan, then back at Dalton. So if you're telling me he stole a boy, I'm gonna need more proof than Terrence Lowell's word. Dalton's face darkened. I'm the law here. You're a law, Ben said calmly. But there's law, and then there's what's right. And from where I'm standing, this don't look right. The men behind Ben nodded, their hands resting on their rifles. Dalton's eyes moved from face to face, calculating. Then he spat into the dust. This ain't over. Maybe not, Ben said, but it's over for today. Dalton remounted, his face a mask of cold fury. He jerked his horse around and rode off, his men following. The dust rose behind them, and then they were gone. Cade let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Ben rode up beside him, grinning. You always did have a talent for finding trouble, Cade. Thanks, Ben. Ben looked at Ethan, then back at Cade. Boy yours. He is now. Ben nodded slowly. Then you best take care of him. Dalton won't forget this. I know. Ben tipped his hat and turned his horse. Stay safe, Cade. You too. The riders disappeared over the ridge, and Cade and Ethan stood alone in the quiet morning. Ethan looked up at Cade, his face pale but steady. What now? Cade slung the rifle back onto his saddle. Now we keep moving. They rode for 2 more days, keeping to the back trails, avoiding towns. Cade didn't talk much, and Ethan didn't push. They camped under the stars, ate beans and hardtack, and kept the fire small. On the 3rd night, as they sat by the creek, Ethan finally spoke. You think they'll come after us again? Cade poked the fire with a stick. Maybe. Dalton's got pride, Lowell's got money. That's a dangerous combination. Ethan nodded slowly. Why'd those men help us? Because they knew me, knew I wouldn't steal a boy for no reason. Cade looked at him, and because they've seen men like Lowell before, they know what he is. Ethan stared into the flames. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. What do you want to do? I don't know. Ethan's voice was small. I thought I'd have the farm, thought I'd work it like my pa did, but that's gone. Cade was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You could come with me." Ethan looked up, surprised. "Where are you going?" "I got a small piece of land up north. Nothing fancy, just a cabin, a few acres. I've been trying to work it, but it's too much for one man." He met Ethan's eyes. "Could use a hand." Ethan stared at him. "You mean it?" "I do." "Why?" Ethan's voice cracked. "After what you told me, after what happened to my pa, why would you want me around?" Cade's throat tightened. "Because I can't change the past, but maybe I can do something about the future." Ethan looked down at his hands, his jaw working. "I'm still angry at you." "I know. I don't know if that'll ever go away." "I don't expect it to," Cade said quietly, "but anger and work can coexist, and if you decide one day you can't stand being around me, you'll have saved enough to move on." Ethan was silent for a long time. Then he said, "My pa used to say a man's measured by what he does when no one's watching." Cade nodded. He was right. Ethan looked up, his eyes red but steady. "I'll come with you, but I'm not doing it for you, I'm doing it for me." "That's fair." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. After a while, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the watch. He turned it over in his hands, studying the initials. "He never told me about the first fire," Ethan said quietly. "Never said a word." "Maybe he didn't want you carrying it," Cade said. "Or maybe he forgave you." Ethan looked at him. "You ever think of that?" Cade's chest tightened. He hadn't, not once in 12 years. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I'd like to believe it." Ethan nodded and slipped the watch back into his pocket. "Me too." They stayed by the fire until the stars came out, and for the first time since they'd met, the silence between them felt less like a wound and more like a bridge. "So let me ask you something. If you were Cade, carrying 12 years of guilt, would you have walked past that boy? Or would you have done what he did, even knowing it might not fix what's broken?" Take a breath, pour yourself something warm, and think about that. Because sometimes the hardest thing a man can do isn't saving someone else. It's forgiving himself. The cabin sat in a narrow valley, surrounded by pine trees and bisected by a cold, clear stream. It wasn't much, a single room with a stone fireplace, a loft for sleeping, and a small barn out back, but it was sturdy and it was Cade's. When they arrived, Ethan stood in the doorway looking around. "This is it." "This is it." Ethan nodded slowly. "It's quiet." "It is." They spent the first week in near silence, working the land. Cade taught Ethan how to mend fence posts, how to clear brush, how to read the sky for weather. Ethan learned quickly, his hands growing rough and capable. At night, they ate together by the fire, and sometimes Ethan would take out the watch and stare at it, lost in thought. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sun set, Ethan spoke. "I've been thinking about my pa." Cade looked over at him. "Yeah." "Yeah," Ethan turned the watch over in his hands. "I used to think he was invincible, like nothing could hurt him, but he wasn't. He was just a man trying to do right by his family." Cade said nothing. "I think he'd want me to move forward," Ethan continued. "Not forget, but move forward." "I think you're right." Ethan looked at him. "I'm still angry sometimes." "I know. But I'm also grateful." Ethan's voice was steady. "You didn't have to do what you did. You could have ridden past Ashford and never looked back." "I couldn't," Cade said quietly. "Not after I saw you." Ethan nodded. "I know." They sat in silence, the valley darkening around them. A month later, riders appeared at the edge of the property. Cade recognized Ben Holloway immediately, along with two of the men who'd been on the ridge that day. They dismounted and walked over, and Ben grinned. "Heard you were up here, thought we'd check in." "Appreciate it," Cade said. Ben glanced at Ethan, then back at Cade. "Boy settling in." "He is." "Good." Ben's expression grew serious. "Dalton's been asking questions, So has Lowell, thought you should know. Cade's jaw tightened. They coming after us. Not yet, but word got around about what happened. Folks in Ashford started talking. Turns out Lowell's business wasn't as legal as he claimed. Ben smiled faintly. Sheriff 2 counties over got wind of it. Lowell's in custody now. Dalton's keeping his head down. Cade exhaled slowly. That's good news. It is, Ben clapped him on the shoulder. You did right, Cade. Not many men would have. After Ben and the others left, Cade and Ethan stood together in the yard. Ethan looked up at him, his face thoughtful. It's over. For now. Ethan nodded. Then I guess we keep working. Yeah, Cade said, we keep working. Epilogue. Years later, Ethan would still wake some nights and reach for his boots, checking to make sure they were there. The habit never quite left him. Neither did the watch, which he kept on a shelf above his bed, polished and cared for. The cabin grew. They added a second room, then a third. The land produced enough to keep them fed and clothed, and sometimes, on quiet evenings, neighbors would stop by, men like Ben Holloway, who remembered what it meant to stand for something. Cade never stopped carrying the weight of what he'd done, but over time, it became something he could live with. Ethan never stopped being angry, not completely, but he also never stopped being grateful. And on the day Ethan finally handed the watch to his own son, years after Cade had passed, buried on a hill overlooking the valley, he told the boy the story. Not the sanitized version, but the true one. Your great-grandfather gave this to a man who failed him, Ethan said, turning the watch over in his hands. And that man spent the rest of his life trying to make it right. His son looked up at him. Did he? Ethan thought about it. Then he smiled, small and sad and true. He tried, and sometimes that's enough. The watch gleamed in the firelight, the initials still clear after all those years. E.M. Ethan Merrick. The boy Cade saved, the man Cade raised, the son Cade never had. And in the quiet of that valley, surrounded by the life they'd built together, the ghosts finally rested. The sun dipped lower, dust rose faintly around the cabin, and somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied softly, its hooves quiet on the earth. Dream peacefully tonight.